Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Guy Charles. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to the program that is put on by the Program in Public Law after Charlottesville, Statues and Symbols in American Law and Society. Before briefly introducing our panelists, what I'd like to do, it is our Dean's birthday today. We are obligated, not just in the hand clap, but we have to sing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear David. Happy birthday to you. It is also his last year as dean, and we are extremely, extremely sad. But in any event, I know that you will remember us fondly. All right. So now to turn to this program. My colleague, Neil Siegel, who's one of the co-directors, along with Professor Chris Schrader, have put on this. Neil had this idea to put on this program, and we're excited to participate. I will briefly introduce each of the four panelists. They will talk for 7 to 10 minutes, give or take a couple. And then afterwards, it might be, depending on the time, a short period of interaction, but then we will invite your participation. I'm not going to say much about each of them. They're each distinguished individuals, so I will just tell you who they are and the order they will be speaking. First, we'll have Professor Trina Jones, who's a wonderful scholar on race and socioeconomic status and inequality, has written over a variety of issues, including color differentiation and same-race individuals on the basis of skin color. She will be our first speaker. Then we'll have Professor Thavolia Glymph, who's a professor of history and African-American studies here at Duke. She will also be our John Hope Franklin visiting professor this spring, and so she will follow and be next. Then we'll have Professor Jeff Powell, who is a professor of constitutional law, who served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel, who's done a number of different things, and of course is a wonderful colleague here on this faculty. And the last, but obviously not least, Professor Neil Siegel, Professor of Law and Political Science, as co-director, as I mentioned, of the Program in Public Law, also teaches constitutional law. Each of these great individuals will share their thoughts with you on this program, and it is my distinctive honor to be the moderator of this panel with this group of luminaries. So first, Professor Trina Jones.
Thank you, Guy. So good afternoon. It is wonderful to be with you today. Please note that I'm not speaking on behalf of Duke University, Duke Law School, or even in my role as a professor here. I'm speaking as a Black female citizen of this country, one who is honestly struggling in this moment. Today, I offer personal reflections on what it feels like to face symbols of white supremacy and on activism. I should warn you in advance that some of the imagery in the PowerPoint presentation is disturbing, and therefore you might choose to not look. So I grew up in Rock Hill, South Carolina. When I was a child, Rock Hill was a town of about 40,000 people. There were 2 high schools. The local industry was based on textile manufacturing. It was a mill town comprised mostly of blue-collar workers. The population was about 40% Black and 60% white. There were very few Asians, Latinos, or Indigenous Americans. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, the Klan marched down Main Street. I don't recall the exact imagery, but what I do remember is the agitation and worry the event wrought among the older members of my family, the people I turned to for protection. There was a sense of vulnerability, of intimidation, of threat that permeated the family and that filtered down to me. There was very little that my elders could do because they were Black and they were poor. And for the people who had lived through the ravages of Jim Crow, they knew what the message was that the Klan was sending. You are not wanted here. Nigger, stay in your place or else. And you may choose to look away. On August 1st, 2015, less than 2 months after the white supremacist Dylan Roof gunned down 9 worshipers at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, I returned to Rock Hill to visit my sister. As I headed down Highway 161 to my sister's home, a white guy in a pickup truck rolled up behind me at a red light. I gasped as I saw the huge Confederate flag swaying off the bed of his truck. For a moment, all the fear and anxiety in 5-year-old me resurfaced. I thought to myself, who is this person? What hate must infect his soul that he would so proudly and rebelliously display such a divisive symbol, a symbol that for so many of us clearly stands for racial hatred? And how many other people like him are out there, lurking in the shadows? And I think we've learned that quite a few are, it seems.
What do you hope to get out of today? Like, what does it mean to you?
Well, for one thing, it means that we're showing to this parasitic class of anti-white vermin that this is our country. This country was built by our forefathers. It's sustained by us. It's going to remain our country.
All right, so I came pretty well prepared for this thing today. Kel-Tec P3AT, 380 ACP, Glock 19, 9mm, Ruger LC9, also 9mm, and there's a knife. Well, I actually have another AK in that bag over there. You lose track of your fucking guns, huh?
So this is what the most blatant form of white supremacy looks like. This is what it sounds like, and I've been discussing what it feels like, at least to me. And it's not just out there, it is here. It is ugly, it's personal, it's directed. For African Americans, for immigrant citizens and undocumented humans, for Muslims, for members of the LGBTQ community, for Jews. What we see and what we hear are not only words or mere images. These words, these images are a brutal assault to our dignity, to our safety, to our humanity. That is why, when rumors of the KKK marching in downtown Durham surfaced about 2 weeks ago, I was determined to go join the counter-protesters. Some of my colleagues said it's too dangerous, that there was a threat of violence, that to counter-protest would only bring heightened visibility to neo-Nazis and the Klan, that we should do as the SPLC suggests and organize a counter-protest at a different time. Perhaps some felt that taking to the streets was anti-intellectual and militant. I heard all of these arguments, but I nonetheless determined to go because for me, the violence was in allowing white supremacists to march unimpeded down Main Street. 5-year-old me was powerless to do anything in Rock Hill, but middle-aged, middle-class me could do something on August the 18th in Durham. I could join with my fellow community members and say, not here, not now, not on my watch. In Durham, North Carolina in 2017, white supremacists will not parade unchallenged. In a society where racial violence, hate speech, and monuments to hate are ubiquitous, I do not feel safe. My family members do not feel safe. Members of marginalized communities across this country do not feel safe, and we haven't felt safe for some time now. We do not have the luxury to walk away, to yield to evil, to protest only when it's safe and convenient to do so. We know that we or a family member could be killed, deported, or molested at any moment on any day. We understand that to do nothing in the violence of the moment allows for future violence in our institutions. Indeed, I fear that our silence last fall, and Facebook and Twitter posts to your friends don't count, in the face of misogyny, xenophobia, religious intolerance, and racial bigotry, allowed these ideas to become more normalized and to infiltrate and flourish in the most powerful corridors of our government. You may say, but what about preserving history? And what about free speech and the legal process? I would suggest to you that monuments to hate in public spaces have much more to do with who and what we choose to remember than they do with preserving history. And with regards to free speech and the legal process, well, let me just say, when activists toppled the statue of a Confederate soldier in front of the old Durham County Courthouse, a colleague wrote the following to me, quote, "My son has asked me to call the DA's office to ask that the charges against the Durham folks who pulled down the Confederate statue be dropped. I'm sympathetic, but then wondered whether that would mean that white supremacists who topple a statue of MLK should be accorded the same treatment. If not, then how would such treatment of the Confederate topplers be consistent with the First Amendment? Curious as to your thoughts," end quote. My response, which took about 2 seconds, was, quote, "I really don't care about the First Amendment doctrine right now. This is about basic moral principles. There's no equivalency between those seeking to abolish white supremacy and those seeking to promote it." Similarly, when a high-level Duke University administrator wrote that rather than use civil disobedience, we should rely upon, quote, "legitimate, law-abiding processes, however long they take," end quote, I angrily wrote to a friend, what law does he have faith in? The law that permits the killers of black men to walk free? The law that sanctions the gerrymandering of our political process? The law that allows affronts to human dignity at our borders? The law that tolerates unequal representation in institutions of higher learning? The line, "however long it takes," in particular, made my blood boil. As Catherine McKinnon observed over 25 years ago in Only Words, a request for patience in the face of injustice, a request that we wait and let the process work, means that you do not really believe that we are injured. The phrase, "however long it takes," also reminded me of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he responded to arguments that the protesters should negotiate, use regular processes, and perhaps wait for new political leadership. Dr. King said, "I guess it's easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you've seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you're forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. For people living on the margins, for those of us who feel the fierce urgency of now, there is no safe haven. There is no space to rest. We cannot wait. To be sure, this is law school, so we must talk about the law and the First Amendment, and many will do so here today. But instead of asking whether and how racism can be eliminated while maintaining the integrity of other interests implicated in the status quo, I hope that we can instead ask how these traditional interests and values serve as mechanisms of racial oppression. And we must not only focus solely on symbols and monuments, but we must turn a critical gaze on the ways in which white supremacy and white hegemony are incorporated in societal institutions and structures. Residential segregation, unequal educational resources, wealth and income gaps, admissions policies, discriminatory hiring and promotion practices, mass incarceration, inadequate access to health care. Let me conclude with 2 thoughts. First, each of us has to figure out how we will respond in this moment. If you choose to engage in counter-protest activity, and I am not saying that you should, but if you do, you must be prepared, and you must know the risk. Keep in mind that the risks have always been high, Lest we engage in revisionist history or glamorize the protests of the 1960s, we must remember that those activists, including Fannie Lou, Medgar, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, those activists risked everything. They were threatened, beat down, and some were killed. The risks are equally high, if not higher, today, as we are in an open carry state and faced with a militia that is armed and that craves violence. You must know the risk and decide for yourself what risks are worth taking. Second, in a moment of moral crisis, which I believe we are in, we cannot hide behind the law, process, or abstract theory. Abstract analyses are the privilege and the province of elites. If we had a crit on this faculty, and Jad Purdy comes pretty close, I would recommend that you all read his latest essay, Laundered Violence. But if we had a crit on this faculty, she would teach you that law, process, and theory are limited by the forces that shape that law, those processes, and those theories. In other words, they are biased in favor of elites and against those who have limited voice and limited access to justice. So I implore you, as we move forward with what I hope will be a series of robust conversations throughout the fall and into future years, to keep your analyses grounded in reality. Remember the subjective nature of perspective and the privileged space from which you choose to act or not. More importantly, remember, as my deceased colleague and friend Jerome Culp used to say, law is ultimately about real people. If that law cannot protect the most vulnerable people in our society, then why are we here? And more importantly, what can we and what can you do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jones. Professor Glymph.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I left my paper in the car, so I will be reading from my computer. Luckily, I have that. Like Trina, I am a descendant, well, I don't know if you're a descendant, but I am from South Carolina. I am also a descendant of slaves. And because I am, and because I grew up in the South, I have a long history with monuments, of walking the ground saturated with monuments, streets, and schools named for Confederate soldiers, politicians, slaveholders. I grew up in a place where voter suppression was legal. But I also grew up in a place where resist was part of the common vocabulary in my home and in my community. The massacre of 9 Black parishioners, 6 women and 3 children at Mother Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston in June of 2015 served as a long overdue wake-up call to the problem not only of violence, physical violence against African Americans, but also the violence of monuments, the violence of statues named for Confederate soldiers and generals and politicians. And it also served as a sort of wake-up call, asking us what we would do, not only about Charleston, but about the nation. Established in the second decade of the 19th century, Mother Emanuel is the oldest African Methodist Episcopal Church south of Baltimore. Mother Emanuel has always stood in opposition to discrimination, in opposition to the South's determination to deny Black people freedom and citizenship, even after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In the aftermath of the, of the rumored 1822 Denmark Vesey Rebellion, A mob of white people burned down Mother Emanuel. Black people rebuilt it after the Civil War. Following the massacre, South Carolina lowered the Confederate flag on the State House grounds. Americans all over the country celebrated. They celebrated even though the flag did not go away, even though it was not removed from a public space, just lowered. But a new momentum was building both for and against the removal of Confederate symbols and statues from public spaces that was recharged in the aftermath of the tragedy in Charleston and the death of Heather Heyer. Across the nation, we are debating the question of who we are, of who belongs to the nation state and what that means. The issue resurfaced, of course, at our own institution as more people took note of the fact that two of the statues that graced the portals at Duke Chapel were of pro-slavery Confederate soldiers, one a leading general. President Price moved swiftly to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee, though the statue of Sidney Lanier, a Confederate soldier, remains, but that's a problem for another day. Lee's statue will become part of our archives, and that seems appropriate to me. The presence of his statue on our campus, which was placed here without much comment, or even one could say active support or consent, seems symptomatic of the times in which it was raised on this campus, a time when Black people were politically disempowered and expected to live in a world that, through its symbols, its unequal educational system, and general discrimination, was determined that they know their place. Colleges and universities were not and are not exempt. In 2003, Ruth Simmons, the president of Brown, established a steering committee on slavery and justice, which delivered a stinging report 3 years later. Harvard, Emory, Georgetown, Princeton, Dartmouth, Rutgers, and the College of William and Mary have followed suit, and many other institutions. This past spring, another Duke Endowment institution, Forman, established a task force on slavery and justice. Drew Faust of Harvard has stated bluntly that Harvard was directly complicit in slavery. One of the projects that I am working on now is on the history of Duke and slavery. Like some institutions, Duke can claim that, well, we were established after the war, but we were part of Trinity, and Trinity had slaves. Its president in 1860 had 3 slaves in his household. So my students and I are working on this. Defenders of the display of the Confederate battle flag, which one person recently says, just a piece of cloth, and monuments argue that their heritage is at stake. The opposition that this heritage is a heritage of which no one should be proud. The Confederacy was founded in a bid to establish a modern pro-slavery nation state. This charge was stated explicitly in the ordinances of secession and in the defense of slavery that was a key part of the South's military objectives. So, why are we still fighting the Civil War? Why were monuments erected in the first place? And what work do they continue to do? And there's been a lot of debate and writing about this recently, and so I won't go into that right now. But I would like to say that, a few more words, I think, don't get as much attention. After the Civil War, the nation condemned the slave South. That condemnation was expressed in the 13th Amendment, in the 14th Amendment, in the 15th Amendment, in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, in congressional anti-Klan legislation, and more. But there was never any overall condemnation of slavery as evil, or as an atrocity, or as wreaking a humanitarian crisis, one that we saw during slavery, during the war, and after. The wartime destruction of Black life, the massacres that came after in places like Memphis and New Orleans, on the side of the roads in the South and in the homes of Black people. The rise of Jim Crow, the reunion movements, the Supreme Court decisions that wiped out the progress that had been made Constitutional conventions like the 1890 Mississippi Constitutional Convention that wiped out the voting rights of tens of thousands of black men. And the same was true in Louisiana and other states. All these things are critical to understanding where we are now. The problem with Confederate statutes is also different from the problem of commemorations of British kings and royal families that also dot our landscape, and the naming of towns and cities and roads and even universities. Georgetown, South Carolina, a place, Georgetown University, now North and South Carolina. Though these things may be different from what we are looking at now, they're not different, we should remember, from the use of tribal names of indigenous people as mascots and as the names of states, Illinois, Mississippi, Alabama, and so forth. What we are facing now is also different from what Germany faced after the World War II. Following that war, the German people did not establish monuments to Hitler. The world condemned Nazi Germany, the murder of Jews, gypsies, gay people, and others, the treatment of the mentally ill, all was condemned as evil, and the world pledged never to let it happen again. That did not happen in this country. But what we can look forward to, among other things, is that, at least for me, I'm very happy, that a monument will go up in Charleston, designed by an Israeli-American, Michael Arad, that will commemorate not just the ground on which 9 people lost their lives, but commemorate the resistance of African Americans over the course of nearly 400 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Glymph. Professor Powell.
Thank you, Guy. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. I want to talk about history. I want to present you 4 propositions that I believe to be actually beyond any serious contravention, and that I think may be part of the context in which we need to think about Charlottesville. Let me give them to you first in bullet form, and then I will tell you just a little bit about why I think they're true, though I can't prove it in the time allowed. First, there was no consensus in 1861 about the meaning of secession, not in the country as a whole and not among white Southerners. Second, there were proponents of a view of the U.S. Constitution that creates a strong national government, Hamilton, Marshall, and there were proponents of the Jeffersonian vision of a very weak federal government and a loose confederacy. There were proponents of both positions on both sides of the Union-Confederate line. Third, there was, in fact, no controversy about the avowed instigation for and purpose of secession. It was to protect slavery. Fourth, the post-Civil War use of Confederate symbolism correlates very strongly, some Confederate symbolism correlates very strongly with periods of heightened racial conflict and tension. Let me say just a little bit about each of these propositions. First, no consensus on the meaning of secession. Everyone in 1861 agreed that white Southerners, like everybody else, including black Southerners, had the revolutionary right, as President Lincoln called it, to dismember or overthrow their government. But this revolutionary right was a moral or political right, not a legal right. Revolutionaries are rebels and traitors against the government they seek to overthrow. From this perspective, secession is revolution. The Lincoln administration was perfectly entitled lawfully to attempt to suppress secession by military force. The second position was the diametrical opposite. Secession is the exercise of a constitutional right. The original states entered into the Constitutional Compact by free and independent decision, and all existing states could exit in the same manner. The third position, held by some white Southerners, including the Confederacy's president, Jefferson Davis, split the difference. Davis agreed the right that we are exercising in 1861 is the moral right exercised in 1776 to overthrow our government and replace it with one that we find more congenial. Davis disagreed, found a difference between 1776 and 1861 because he said in 1776 the American patriots were traitors to their sovereign. In 1861, the secessionists are following their sovereign, the individual state. All right, my second proposition was there are Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians on both sides of the Confederate Union divide. I'll give you two examples. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, in his first inaugural address, said of the Confederate Constitution that it is the Constitution formed by our forefathers. It's the U.S. Constitution. And its true meaning is revealed in the judicial constructions that have been made of the U.S. Constitution. What cases did he have in mind? Davis's words and deeds before and after answer that plainly. McCulloch against Maryland, Gibbons against Ogden, Ableman against Booth, and yes, Dred Scott. Davis was a principled adherent to the view that the Constitution of the United States and of the Confederate States creates a powerful, if in some respects limited, federal government. Go to the other side. Let's look at Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln, Lincoln's appointee to the position of Chief Justice of the United States. Chase hated slavery, and he thought that the United States government was entitled to take certain unusual measures in the emergency of the early Civil War. But he was, as a young man, a Jeffersonian Democrat, and he remained a Jeffersonian in his thinking throughout. If you go through Chase's opinions as Chief Justice and his votes as Chief Justice, you will see someone who, with the exception of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which, after all, had become part of the Constitution, with that exception, Chase remains a principled adherent to the Jeffersonian limited government vision. All right, my third proposition may be the most controversial, but it's one that it's actually hard to argue about if you look at the record. The avowed purpose of secession, as stated in every declaration of the causes of secession adopted by any so-called Confederate state, were slavery. Now, were there other political debates in the antebellum period that had a regional cast to them? Of course. South Carolina had nearly come to blows with Andrew Jackson 30 years earlier over Congress's enactment of a protective tariff. Go read the South Carolina Declaration of the Causes of Secession adopted by the convention there in 1860, December. Not a word about tariffs. Not a word about any other constitutional or legal debate. Many, many, many words about constitutional and legal issues involving slavery. Or as the Mississippi Secession Convention would say about 3 weeks later about secession, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. My fourth proposition was that it had to do with the post-Civil War use of Republican symbols. That's a fascinating and complicated story. But there's one theme that emerges very clearly if you read the complicated story carefully. One thing's quite clear. The creation of permanent Confederate symbols, monuments, other kinds of memorials, place names, building names. The creation of such permanent symbols correlates very strongly with rises in racial tension. If you look at the record, the creation of such permanent symbols spikes 3 times. It spikes in the 1890s, the decade of Jim Crow and disenfranchisement of African American men. It spikes in the period from roughly 1915 to roughly 1935. 1915 is the year that the KKK is reinvented as a nationwide racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Catholic, nativist organization. And the third period in which there's a spike in the creation of permanent Confederate symbolism is, of course, the late 1940s through the late 1960s, the period of the modern civil rights movement and of the struggle over desegregation. I do not claim to you that any of these or all of these propositions of fact answer the questions in themselves of what we should do as a community about existing Confederate symbols today. I do suggest to you that they are part of the context in which we have to think about what we should do in 2017, and that in doing that thinking, we ought to get our history right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Neil Siegel.
Well, thank you, Guy. I want to begin by thanking the Dean for his support in our holding this event, and my gratitude to Guy and Trina and Thavolia and Jeff for your participation in it. We may be in for a difficult year. There may be more Charlottesvilles. There may be events that are far worse than Charlottesville, and so that I hope when events do arise that we will be able, as a community, to face them and to face them responsibly together. And for the students in the audience, I would encourage you to take ownership of this community and not just wait for the faculty or the administration to respond. Whether acting individually or through the organizations you're a part of, reach out to faculty you know or want to know if you think there are events and conversations that we should be having that we haven't. All right, well, we've already seen from some of the other presenters today how the tools of historians can be quite useful in contextualizing debates about the meaning and significance of various statues and monuments and memorials. And what I want to begin by suggesting is that the tools you're learning in law school are quite relevant as well. Lawyers have both technical analytical tools that they can bring to bear, as well as more theoretical historical tools. So take, for example, the claim that these Confederate monuments are about our history and culture. That's the stated end or objective that is being claimed as being served by preserving these monuments. And if you do the kind of means-ends analysis you learn in the basic course in constitutional law, you might ask about the relationship between the means and the stated end. Part of what this analysis can accomplish is to smoke out illegitimate or impermissible purposes. If there's a lack of a good tight fit between the means and the ends, then perhaps the actual purpose is different than the stated purpose. And when you do this with respect to Confederate monuments and the stated objective of preserving our history and culture, what you learn is that there's actually quite a bit of under-inclusiveness. There's all manner of American history and culture that are not well represented in these Confederate monuments, and that will cause good lawyers to start asking questions about, well, who put them there? When were they put there? Who opposed them? Who was not permitted to oppose them? And this might result in a reassessment or a critical assessment of what the actual objectives were and are today. And in fact, as I'll suggest in a few minutes, there's actually an over-inclusiveness problem as well, because much more often than not, these monuments were not contemporaneous celebrations of history and culture. As Jeff has pointed out, they came after the fact in the service of other objectives that very few people would publicly be prepared to support today. What about theoretical historical tools? Well, something else you learn in constitutional law and related classes is that when you think about questions of equality or equal citizenship, you're also thinking about status hierarchies, whether racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, hierarchies with respect to sexual orientation or gender identity. How are status hierarchies maintained? And they are maintained through the exercise of power, public and private power, including not just in material ways, although the material consequences and harms can be unspeakably severe, but also through the dissemination of social meanings. right? The dissemination of social meanings, which I think is a lot of what monuments and memorials accomplish. And so I think we should ask ourselves, what is the dominant social meaning of Confederate monuments? A virtue of the public controversy over them in recent weeks is that it has made their histories popular. Now everyone knows, or at least should know, when and therefore why the monuments were first raised. And as I've already mentioned, what the record reveals is much more often than not, they're not contemporaneous Confederate celebrations of history and culture. In historical context, whether these memorials were of Lee or Stonewall or of an anonymous Confederate soldier, they were always and emphatically monuments to Jim Crow. Our own Walter Dellinger reminded me of a good example yesterday, and this is of the Silent Sam monument at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a few miles from here. What was said at the unveiling of that Confederate monument on June 2nd of 1913? Well, the industrialist and philanthropist Julian S. Carr spoke at that dedication, and in speaking, he offered a tribute to what he called the Christian Anglo-Saxon race. And his address, the whole address is available at the UNC library, but I just want to read one tiny portion of it, and it is not difficult, it is difficult to hear, but I do think it's important to share it with you. And this is what he had to say. I trust I may be pardoned for one allusion, howbeit it is rather personal. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days, perhaps after my return from Appomattox, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds, because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned a Southern lady, and then rushed for protection to these university buildings, where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed the pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison, and for 30 nights afterwards slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head. So it's not just what he did and how he regarded what he did, and then what he thought in retrospect, and then what he uttered, reflecting what he thought, but the utter sense of comfort and entitlement to utter these words publicly, all right, at the very moment this monument is being unveiled. We should continue, I think, to debate whether, when, and how Confederate monuments should come down. I regard that actually as a complex question. But I think even more important than that debate is for Americans to continue to think and rethink what it means to reject racism and what it means to do so in very practical terms. One reason racism from a century ago matters so much today is because racism continues to matter so much today. To be sure, the Confederate so-called heroes are a special case because they were not simply racist, they were also anti-American. We are, after all, talking about the most serious attempt to destroy the Republic in our nation's history. But it's also the case, and I take no pleasure in saying it, but it's also the case that many patriotic Americans have long exhibited profound racism. And that is true no matter how uncomfortable or irritating it is for many white Americans to be reminded of this fact. The presence today of neo-Nazis, the Klan, other white supremacists who are emerging to defend Confederate monuments, I think it clarifies not only what these monuments mean today, but also how much work remains to be done to counteract racism. To remove statues, or to think more creatively, to supplement them with plaques that visibly make clear in large letters who put them there, when and why, is one symbolic step. But that step will ultimately prove a hollow one unless and until Americans struggle much harder and are prepared to make sacrifices both materially and expressively in order to make modern American society itself a monument to racial equality and justice.
All right, we have a few minutes, so let's use the remaining time to take some questions. I think what we might do is take them 2 or 3 at a time, so that way we can at least try to maximize the time that we have left before we send you all away. So questions for our panelists. Let's take 2 or 3 of them at a time. Yes, go ahead, Sid. Sydney. Okay, let's take a couple more. Thank you. Yes.
So for some of these instances, they're rather obvious that things should be taken down or changed, but some things become a little more controversial depending on who they are and what they do. So as you go from the more obvious ones to the more controversial ones, you have a smaller consensus. Where do you start to strike a balance of, okay, maybe to keep the large consensus of people, we should just not talk about this issue as much and focus on more controversial things to work away down? Where is that balance?
There's one more. All right, let's start with those 2. Anybody?
Yeah, I'm certainly open to Sydney's position, and right, if the overwhelming majority of African Americans in this country, or the strong majority of African Americans, think that's what should happen, then right, I think that should be taken extraordinarily seriously in light of what should happen. I also think we should resist, at least in thinking collectively, the urge to simply conclude that's the right answer in all cases. You might actually educate people more, right, if they walked past that Silent Sam statue and saw this address. You can simply take it away. And again, if the image of it is so painful, right, to fellow members of the community whom I really care about, then that may be the answer. But I also think there's a loss, right? I'd like to educate people about, right, why it's there, what was actually said when it was put up there, and that could also serve, I think, an anti-racist educational function. So I'm not suggesting that I know the answer about what should happen, but I do think we should think about it and not simply assume that, right, there's only one possible conclusion, or that it's the same conclusion in all circumstances, regardless of what kind of monument we're talking about.
The 2 questions nicely fit together, because my own view is that the answer to Jeremy's is that we are not going to find consensus any time in the near future. We're going to have to live with disagreement. My own way of stating my objective would be to say, I'd like to find the maximum way to have people understand and acknowledge the points that are being made by people with whom they disagree. And I'm talking about people who are making points in informed and civil discussion. That's a separate question than the issue that Professor Jones raised about when civil discussion is not the way to handle things. But I think we have to live with the fact we're not going to have consensus. Not any time in my lifetime, and probably any time in the lifetime of anyone in this room.
Trina, Thavolia? Either of you?
Go ahead. I mean, yeah, I'll follow you.
So I have many thoughts circulating in my head in response to Sydney's question. And Jeremy, I think I would want to ask for some examples of what you think is easy and what you think is more controversial, because I'm not sure that any of this is easy, right? I go back to Catherine McKinnon's words, right? This request that we utilize legal processes, that we engage in civil discussion, ignores the injury and the urgency to redress the injury, right? If people are conveying that these statutes, these symbols, are not just speech, but are an act of racial subordination, then how can we tolerate, right? In those clear instances, and we'll have to discuss what are the clear instances, right? How can we tolerate having them to continue to exist, even for educational purposes? Is there a way to remedy the subordination and also further some educational endeavor? It sounds a lot like all deliberate speed in the Brown versus Board of Education opinions, right? There's a constitutional violation. Here, one would argue, and many scholars before us have argued, that this is a form of racial subordination. These are not words, these are acts, right? If there is a violation, why take time, right, in remedying it? So I hear that. I think, Sydney, in your observation. At the same time, I hear, Jeremy, you saying that there are going to be some complex instances, right, where we will have to have more conversation about what is to be done.
Thavolia?
So I think this is complex. Sydney? Right. I don't think that, I think most thinking Americans, and I use that term very loosely, would agree that they need to come down, all of them.
I think a Gallup poll actually contradicts that.
I
said thinking.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm aware of the Gallup poll. Yeah. So, but I also think that they will never ever all come down. I think the big question, at least for me, is why not? Why there will never be a consensus to take them all down? Because it's not just taking down monuments, it's renaming streets, renaming buildings. You mentioned Julian Carr. We have a building on campus, the Carr Building, which houses the history department, named for Julian Carr. We're not in a situation or anywhere near similar to the one Germany was in 1945. Basically, you had a period of from 1933 to 1945, when the Nazis, gained control and did these atrocious things. We have 300 years plus of putting stuff up, naming stuff for people whose lives were in many ways we find today despicable. And then we have Jefferson. What do we do with him, And one of the foremost scholars on Jefferson, Annette Gordon Reed, who's argued that he should not be taken down. Many scholars argue that those who were founding fathers, contributed something, even if they owned slaves. It's a hard question. We will, in this country, I don't think we will have a clean, clear landscape ever. And then the question becomes, how do we make that unclean landscape a disempowered landscape? How do we disempower? And maybe it's through plaques. I'm not sure. I'm still thinking through what I think should happen next. Plaques that like this one for Silent Sam, that really account for when it went up, why it went up, and who said what. That helps to disempower that particular landscape. But we can't do it for everyone. I mean, there are thousands. And, I once told my students when I first came to Duke that I drive to campus on Jeff Davis Highway every day. And one student said, "Who's he?" What I think the current debate is doing is making us more aware of our history. There's never been a time like this when people were asking questions about who we are, of the kind that we're asking today. So I'm optimistic, but I don't think we'll have a clean landscape.
So we are out of time for now, but let me encourage you along the lines of what Professor Siegel said, which is part of what's great about this community is that we figure out ways of having difficult conversations, which we have been having for the last few years and which we'll continue to have, not just this year and the years to come. Let us continue to take advantage of those and come together and work together and hopefully resolve. We won't resolve all of these problems, but I think we have faith in all of you that we can make some headway on some of them. Thank you for your time today, and I hope that we honored your time by through the insights of this panel. Thank you.